You can blow out your candles now, Mom. But please don't say anything that'll make this about you. I smiled, or something like it. My hands folded politely in my lap, though they were trembling. It's strange how after 80 years, you can still be sent straight back to the quiet corner of a childhood classroom, where the teacher asks you not to speak out of turn. Only now the voice belongs to your daughter, and the birthday cake is yours. The laughter around the table continued, but it washed right over me. The champagne flutes clinked. Mark made a joke about early retirement, and someone's toddler was crying under the table. All the motion in the room, the dresses, the serving trays, the camera flashes, kept me hidden in plain sight. A relic at the far end of the table, lit up but never quite seen. I tried to share a memory. That's all. Just a small story about Charles. How he'd burned the first cake he ever tried to make for me. How the frosting stuck to the bottom of the pan, and we ate it anyway with spoons. The memory floated in, warm and unexpected, like the scent of something familiar. But as soon as I opened my mouth, Rachel's smile hardened. Then came the sentence. That sentence. I didn't try again. Instead, I looked at the candles flickering unevenly on the cake. 8 thin pink sticks, one for each decade, wobbling in frosting too white to be homemade. I blew them out in one steady breath. No one asked me to make a wish. When the plates were cleared, I drifted from room to room like a guest who didn't quite belong. I overheard someone compliment the floral arrangements. Mark was talking business near the fireplace, something about estate planning, I think, but his voice lowered when I passed. I didn't stop walking. I didn't want to hear what they weren't saying out loud. By the time the guests had left, Rachel and Mark were gone too, claiming exhaustion and a sitter to relieve. I offered to help clean up, but Rachel just touched my elbow lightly and said, "Don't worry, we've got it all handled." Like I might break if handed a sponge. So I stayed. I wandered into the kitchen, where the sink was full of half-submerged wine glasses. The air still smelled like lemon chicken and vanilla wax. I rolled up my sleeves and washed the glasses slowly, methodically, the way Charles used to insist. Clean the rims first, then the base. I miss his voice the most. When I reached for a towel, my eye caught something behind the fridge magnet shaped like a sunflower. It was almost nothing, barely visible. A corner of a photograph, curled with time. I pulled it free. It was a snapshot, faded and grainy. Rachel, no more than 8. Asleep on my shoulder in the back seat of our old Buick. Her mouth slightly open, arms clutched around a stuffed rabbit. I was looking out the window, tired but smiling. Charles must have taken it. He always carried that old camera on road trips. I hadn't seen this photo in years. I didn't know we still had it. I sat down at the kitchen table, dish towel in hand, and stared at the image. I remembered the feel of her small head against my arm. The weight of her trust. How easily children love you before they know what to resent. I turned the photo over. There, in Rachel's handwriting, crooked, full of second-grade effort, were the words, "To Mom, my safest place. Love, Rach. 1983. A breath caught in my throat. It felt like holding a piece of a vanished life, a version of us that no longer existed but once had. Proof that there was love here, that there had been something tender between us once, before the years sanded it down to obligation. The edges of the photo were soft with wear. It had been looked at, maybe even missed. Maybe not by Rachel. Maybe someone else tucked it behind that magnet. Maybe it slipped there by accident. Or maybe it was a quiet offering left behind, too small to be spoken aloud. I folded the towel and laid it gently on the counter. My knees ached as I stood, but I didn't rush. I slipped the photograph into the pocket of my cardigan. Whatever it was, memory, message, mistake, it felt like something I needed to carry. Not just back to the guest room, but further. Like a thread unraveling, pulling me somewhere I hadn't dared go in years. Tomorrow, I'd sit with it again. I didn't know then what it would stir up, what it might break open, or heal. I only knew that something had shifted. Quietly, the way evening light changes a room without asking permission. A door creaked open, ever so slightly, on a part of our past we had all agreed, silently, to leave locked. But now it whispered. And I was listening. The photo was warm from my hand, the corners soft like an old bedtime blanket. I sat on the porch in my robe, the morning air still clinging to a trace of night. The birds were louder than usual. Or maybe I was just more awake than I'd been in years. I traced Rachel's tiny profile in the photograph with my thumb. Her cheek pressed into my arm, her hair a wild halo of curls flattened by sleep. I remembered the exact moment it was taken. Not because of the photo, but because of the feeling. That summer we camped in Yosemite. Charles insisted on doing it the real way, which meant no showers and too many cans of beans. The pine needles soaked through our tent the second night, and everything smelled like damp earth and charcoal. Rachel had cried after a nightmare, convinced a bear was sniffing outside the canvas. I'd pulled her into my sleeping bag and held her until she slept again, her little fingers curled around mine like twine. Charles took the photo the next morning, while we were still in the car, waiting for the rain to let up. We were happy then. Or close enough. I flipped the photo over again, reading her scrawled words. To Mom, my safest place. Love Rach. 1983. The words had been written without hesitation, without fear of judgment. Back when love was unspoken because it didn't need to be explained. When did we start needing so many words just to be kind? I looked up at the sky, pale and soft, like dishwater before it clouds. I should have gone inside. My tea was going cold. But I couldn't stop staring at that picture. Not because of what it showed, but because of what it didn't. No viternis. No clipped responses. No fear of saying the wrong thing. What happened to us? I reached for my phone and called Rachel. It rang 4 times before her voicemail picked up. Her voice sounded polished, like the kind you use when speaking to a client. Not a mother. Hi, you've reached Rachel Sinclair. Please leave a message and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Beep. I held the phone there, quiet. Then I hung up. What could I possibly say in a message that wouldn't sound desperate? Or worse, pitiful? I didn't want to beg for time. I didn't want to remind her I existed. I just wanted her to remember that she once needed me. That I had been more than a chair at the end of a table. Inside, I made myself a fresh cup of tea, though the kettle felt heavier than usual. My joints protested every movement. I carried the cup to the dining table and sat down slowly. The photograph lay between my fingers again. I pulled a notepad from the drawer, the kind I use for grocery lists. The lines were faint blue, too neat for what I was about to write. But I began anyway. Dear Rachel, you were 8 when you wrote that I was your safest place. I've held on to that sentence all morning. Not because it flatters me, but because I want to ask you something. When did I stop being that for you? I know things have changed. Life changes us. Maybe I didn't say enough when I should have. Maybe I said too much when silence would have been kinder. But I was always trying to protect you, even when I didn't know how. I'm not writing this to fix things. I just want you to know I remember who we used to be. Love, Mom. I didn't sign my full name. I didn't even date the page. It wasn't meant for the mailbox. I folded it gently, like something sacred, and slipped the photograph inside. The bundle felt private, honest, unpolished in a way I hadn't allowed myself to be in years. I tucked it into the drawer by the sink, behind the batteries and old menus. Somewhere I could find it again if I ever needed to remember who I still was. I didn't know what I'd do with it yet. But for now it was enough that it existed. Enough that something had finally been said. There's a particular sound a house makes when no one needs you. It's not silence, not exactly. It's the soft tick of a wall clock you've stopped looking at. The hum of the refrigerator that no longer holds birthday cakes or juice boxes. The occasional creak of floorboards settling, like an old man sighing in his sleep. That's what my house sounded like most days now. Every morning, I watered the plants on the windowsill, geraniums mostly, and one stubborn basil that refused to die. I fed the birds at the feeder Charles hung years ago, even though the squirrels always got there first. I walked through the grocery store with no list, no hurry, letting the voices and bright fluorescent lights brush against me like static. Sometimes I paused by the cereal aisle just to hear a child laugh, even if it wasn't mine. Back home, the quiet returned before I even shut the front door. I kept the television off. It felt like cheating. Manufactured noise. Instead, I listened to the slow rhythm of my own movements. The way my slippers whispered across the tile. The click of the stove when I boiled a single egg. I'd started talking to myself again. Soft, barely their mutterings. Not out of madness. Out of muscle memory. A life once full of voices needs somewhere to echo. The photo and letter to Rachel stayed in the drawer near the sink. I opened it now and then, just to touch the paper. As if that alone could keep something tethered between us. My house used to be loud. It used to breathe. There were arguments. God, there were arguments. Rachel slamming her door after curfew. Mark trying to sneak beer into the garage fridge. Charles whistling while he burned toast every Sunday. Music playing in the background. Phones ringing. People needing things from me. Now even the phone seemed to ring less. Most of the pictures on the walls hadn't been updated in over a decade. I couldn't remember the last time we'd taken one together that wasn't posed and strained. I stood in the hallway one afternoon, staring at an old photo of us. Charles in his fishing hat, Rachel with braces, Mark wearing that hideous neon green shirt he loved. We looked mismatched and messy and entirely alive. My fingers brushed the edge of the frame. The doorbell rang. I jumped. When I opened the door, Eva stood on my porch with a folded paper in her hand and a soft smile. "Morning, Margaret," she said, her voice warm. "Hope I'm not interrupting anything." I gestured at the empty room behind me. "Only myself." She chuckled. "Well then, I wanted to invite you to something. I host a little book group. Nothing formal. Just tea and pages. Thought you might like it." I took the flyer from her fingers, my hand brushing hers. It had the names of a few books, dates scribbled in blue ink. "I'm not much of a joiner," I said. "I wasn't either," she replied. "Until I was." I smiled, polite. The way you smile when you want someone to feel appreciated, but not welcomed in too deep. "I'll think about it." She nodded. "We meet next Tuesday. You'd be more than welcome." When she left, the silence returned almost guiltily. I placed the flyer on the kitchen table, beside my cold tea, and didn't look at it again. That evening, I sat on the porch with a blanket across my lap, watching dusk turn the sky the color of an old bruise. The trees swayed gently, the birds quieting, the light folding itself down. I reread the letter to Rachel in my lap, mouthing the words as if they belonged to someone else. Something about the photo still clung to me, like a whisper just behind the ear. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more, that somewhere, tucked between memory and dust, something else waited. And then I remembered. Charles had printed doubles of all his favorite pictures. Always. He said one for the wall, one for the box. He kept them in his old red toolbox in the garage, hidden beneath wrenches and mismatched screws, like sacred things disguised as junk. I hadn't touched it since he passed. The thought of opening it made my chest tighten, like trying to open a jar sealed too long. But now, holding the photo again in my hands, I felt it. A need. Not just to remember, but to reach. I folded the letter gently and stood. The air was colder now. My knees ached. But I knew where I was going. Tomorrow, I'd open the box. The garage door groaned as Margaret tugged it open, its rusted hinges protesting after years of disuse. The afternoon light barely reached the back wall, casting long shadows over the cluttered space that smelled of turpentine and damp cardboard. Cobwebs fluttered like lace curtains in the corners, and the concrete floor was cold beneath her slippers. She hadn't stepped in here in years. The toolbox sat on the workbench like a memory with a lid, red metal dulled to rose-brown, the handle stiff with time. Margaret hesitated, running a fingertip over the dust that coated the surface. She could almost hear Charles humming as he rummaged through it, his back hunched, muttering about misplaced wrenches and stripped screws. He had always kept things too long. Like grief. With a breath she didn't know she was holding, she unlatched the lid. It creaked open, revealing layers of carefully arranged tools, yellowed instruction manuals, and old batteries. Tucked between a roll of duct tape and a stack of faded receipts was what she had come for. The photo. It was exactly as she remembered. Rachel, no more than 8, nestled against her, cheeks flushed from cold or marshmallows or love. Margaret's own face looked tired but peaceful, her head tilted protectively over her daughter's. The corners of the print were worn, the gloss cracked in places where it had been handled too much or not enough. She cradled it gently, then noticed the envelope beneath it, cream-colored, sealed, with Charles's handwriting. To Rachel, when you're ready. Margaret's heart paused. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up. The seal was still tight. She hadn't known this existed. Had he meant to give it to Rachel? Had he forgotten? Or had he waited for the right time that never came? She thought of last week. Rachel's voice cold as frost, dismissive, rushing through their phone call like it was a chore. Margaret had swallowed her hurt, as usual, and said goodbye with her softest voice, the one that used to lull her children to sleep. Now her thumb hovered over the edge of the envelope. It wasn't addressed to her, but it was here. He had left it behind in their home. Unsent, unshared, unspoken. Would Rachel even care to read it now? Margaret blinked slowly, then broke the seal. The paper inside was worn but legible, written in Charles's sharp but weary hand. She lowered herself onto the old wooden stool beside the bench and began to read. Rachel, if you're reading this, it means your mother found it. That's just like her. Quiet, patient, always doing the work no one notices. I hope, wherever you are, you still have even a thread of curiosity left for the people who raised you. I hope you're ready to hear something not shouted or argued, but written carefully like this. Your mother is the strongest woman I've ever known. She gave more than she had and never asked for applause. I was too proud to say it aloud often enough, but I saw it. I knew what she carried. Raising kids while I traveled, made mistakes, got stubborn. She kept the roof steady when the walls shook. I know you were hurt by things we never talked about. I wish I had talked sooner. I wish I had listened better. Some silences become habits, and those habits cost us years. But I'm asking you now, because I may not get another chance. Don't throw away the woman who tucked you in every night. The woman who stayed up sewing your costumes when you changed your mind the night before Halloween. The woman who kept your secrets when you were 16 and scared and brave all at once. Forgive us, Rach. Forgive her. Love. Dad. Margaret didn't realize she was crying until a drop landed on the page. The garage felt like it was closing in around her. Walls of old paint cans and camping gear echoing memories she hadn't summoned in decades. The smell of pine sap from a box of firewood made her ache. There had been warmth in this home once. And laughter. And hard love that never stopped being love. Even when it got messy. She clutched the letter to her chest, her breath thin, the silence loud. A breeze stirred the edge of a tarp in the corner, and for a moment it sounded like a whisper. This letter could change everything. Or it could sit unopened in Rachel's own drawer someday, unread and discarded. Still, Margaret knew one thing. She couldn't keep it hidden. Not because she believed it would fix what was broken, but because she had spent too long burying words that mattered. And Charles, flawed as he was, had tried, at the very end, to speak one last truth. She folded the letter gently, slipped it back into the envelope, and held it beside the photo. Tomorrow, she thought. Tomorrow, she would find a way to send them both. The envelope was thick, too thick to be mistaken for junk, and Margaret had tucked the photograph between the folds of Charles's letter, as if layering one fragile truth with another. The photo's edges had softened over decades, and she wondered whether Rachel's hands would recognize it before her eyes did. Would her fingers remember the paper's worn curve, the way time had thinned it like old cloth? She stood at the mailbox for a long while before letting the envelope go. As it dropped into the dark slot with a dull clunk, she felt both relief and regret trail behind it. There was no retrieving it now. Days passed. Then a week. Nothing. No call. No text. No polite thank you. Not even a confirmation that it had arrived. Margaret checked her phone with compulsive regularity. Mornings, evenings, the quiet moments when the kettle hissed or a robin sang too sharply outside. The silence stretched until it lost shape, becoming less an absence and more a verdict. She began imagining the envelope's journey. Perhaps it sat unopened on Rachel's kitchen counter, buried beneath receipts and circulars, or worse, perhaps it had been tossed without a second glance. She imagined Rachel's hands dropping it into a bin, the photograph slipping sideways among used coffee filters and junk mail. The thought made her breath hitch. Her hurt hardened, not into fury but into a brittle quiet, the kind that lives behind polite smiles. She found herself vacuuming more, folding laundry that hadn't needed folding, sorting Charles's old records into piles by genre, though she could barely tell jazz from blues. She kept her hands busy so her mind wouldn't turn inward. But the memories intruded anyway. Rachel at 15, her arms folded across her chest like armor, Margaret's voice rising as she tried, again, to ask what was wrong. The slammed door. The silences. The coldness that settled like frost on a pane, thick and impossible to see through. Charles's affair had unraveled everything. Not in a storm, but in whispers and pauses and things left unsaid. Margaret had stayed. She remembered the night she made that decision. Not because she forgave him easily, but because Rachel was still a child and grief was too big a thing to give her all at once. But maybe Rachel had known anyway. Children always do, don't they? Margaret sat at the kitchen table with Charles's letter spread before her. The ink had softened over time, like the voice it came from. She ran her finger along his closing words. I know we failed you in ways we never understood, but your mother never stopped trying. Not for a moment. What exactly had he believed needed forgiveness? The garage had grown colder lately. She'd taken to sitting there some evenings, wrapped in a shawl, as if the quiet could coax meaning from the tools he'd left behind. She reread the letter there, under the single bulb's hum, and sometimes imagined handing it to Rachel face to face. But Margaret wasn't sure if Rachel would ever look her in the eye again. That night, the wind slipped under the eaves with a soft moan, and Margaret couldn't sleep. The house felt too still, like it was holding its breath. She lay staring at the ceiling, counting the creaks and ticks of old wood and clocks. Then she did something she hadn't done in weeks. She called. The phone rang twice. Then again. She almost hung up. But on the fourth ring, a voice. Hello. Margaret sat up slowly. Rachel. There was a pause. Mom. Her name, Mom, wasn't said warmly, but it wasn't sharp either. It just existed, suspended in the space between them. I wasn't sure if you'd answer, Margaret said. I wasn't sure if I should, Rachel replied, a bit too quickly. Then quieter. I got the letter. Margaret pressed the phone tighter against her cheek. I wasn't trying to fix anything. I just thought you should have it. Another silence. This one heavier. I haven't read it all yet, Rachel admitted. I saw the photo. That was from the lake trip, right? Yes. I didn't remember Dad taking it. Margaret's voice caught. You were asleep on my shoulder. You'd had a nightmare. You were 8. Rachel didn't speak for a long moment. When she did, her voice had softened, only slightly. I remember the burnt marshmallows. Margaret smiled faintly. You hated the smoke. Rachel gave a sound, almost a laugh, but not quite. Margaret didn't push further. She didn't ask what Rachel thought of the letter or what it meant. Some moments are too fragile to weigh down with expectations. So she sat with the phone to her ear, listening to her daughter breathe on the other end, letting the quiet finally carry something more than pain. And for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel entirely alone. The phone rang 3 times before Rachel picked up. Margaret hadn't planned the moment. Her finger had hovered over the call button for nearly an hour while she stood barefoot in the kitchen, the late sun brushing against her ankles like a cat. The room was warm with the scent of lemon soap and the quiet hum of the refrigerator. When Rachel's voice came through, dry, careful. Hi, Mom. Margaret forgot to breathe. I wasn't sure you'd answer, she said. I almost didn't. There it was again, that tone. Like Rachel had placed a pane of glass between them, and only opened a tiny crack. Margaret imagined her daughter at home, arms folded, phone tilted against one cheek, probably pacing near the window. Rachel always paced when she was uncomfortable. As a child, it meant she was thinking. As an adult, it meant she was retreating. I got your letter, Rachel added. And the picture. Margaret sat down slowly in the dining chair, the one with the faded green cushion Rachel used to kneel on when she was too small for the table. Did you read it? A pause. Then not yet. Margaret swallowed a lump in her throat. Okay. Rachel exhaled, as if already weary of the conversation. I'm just not ready for that kind of emotional excavation. The phrase felt clinical, as though the letter were a surgical instrument, and not the trembling handwriting of a dying man. Margaret studied the way the light hit the water glass on the table, refracting into thin prisms on the wall. How could Rachel be so far and still feel so close and sharp? You don't have to open it, Margaret said quietly. But you should know, he wrote it for you. Not to fix things. Just to tell the truth. Another silence. Not empty this time, heavy. Breathing. Rachel didn't speak. Margaret imagined her daughter's face. Jaw tight, eyes unreadable. Maybe tears. Maybe none. Then the line went dead. Margaret stared at the phone. No click, no goodbye. Just the flat quiet of disconnection. She didn't call back. What would she say? Please don't hang up. Please pretend we're closer than we are? The hurt didn't rush in this time. It drifted slow and deliberate, like fog rolling across a morning field. Margaret stood up and walked to the sink, rinsing her hands under cool water, though there was nothing to wash away. She let the air settle in the room, let her heart beat slow. She had said what she needed. That mattered, didn't it? Later, she wandered to the porch. The light had shifted. The sky bruised purple at the edges, the crickets just beginning their symphony. She pulled her shawl tight and sat down on the wicker chair. It creaked under her, familiar and patient. On the table beside her was the flyer Eva had left a week ago. A folded paper advertising the neighborhood book club, complete with a smiling stock photo of 3 women laughing over glasses of iced tea. Margaret had scoffed at it then. Now she traced the edge with her finger. She hadn't told anyone about the letter from Charles. Not even Eva. The whole thing felt too sacred, too fragile. But silence had its own weight. It curved her spine in invisible ways, made the house feel colder even when the heater clicked on. Maybe it was time to share something, anything, with someone else. She glanced at the flyer again. This month's book, The Language of Kindness. A nurse's memoir. Fitting, she thought. She could use a little kindness. even if it was borrowed from a story. The next meeting was on Thursday. 2 days away. Margaret looked out at the lawn. The shadows of trees stretched long across the grass. Somewhere beyond her street, in a home she hadn't seen in years, her daughter was likely doing the same thing. Sitting in a chair, staring into the evening, holding something too heavy to touch. She closed her eyes. Charles had always been better at words. Even in death he managed to say what she couldn't. And now, that letter, those trembling final sentences, floated between mother and daughter like a paper bridge. Fragile. Possibly strong enough. Possibly not. But Margaret had done her part. She had placed the letter in Rachel's hands. Whether it would be read, understood, forgiven, that was no longer hers to manage. Maybe motherhood was always this. Building bridges you'd never get to cross. The porch light flicked on automatically, casting a soft ring of yellow around her. She stood, smoothed her skirt, and took the flyer inside. She set it on the kitchen counter next to the list she'd made earlier. Birdseed, milk stamps. Her pen hovered. Then she added a fourth item. Thursday book club. It wasn't a promise. But it was something. Upstairs, the bed waited. Clean sheets, folded pajamas, the rhythm of the fan spinning slowly overhead. But for once, she didn't feel like closing the door on the day just yet. Instead, she stayed at the kitchen window a little longer, watching her reflection blur with the darkness outside. The face looking back was older, softer, and for a moment, at peace. She whispered, not to the house or to Charles or to Rachel, but just to the air. That was enough. Then she turned off the light. I didn't know what to bring to a book club. Not a casserole. This wasn't the 1960s. Not wine either. I wasn't sure if this was that kind of gathering. In the end, I showed up with nothing but a folded flyer and a cardigan that still smelled faintly of mothballs. Eva greeted me at the door like I'd just returned from war. You made it, she said too brightly. The living room was modest, its furniture mismatched but soft, the cushions bearing the imprint of many conversations. Women clustered in loose circles, teacups balanced on knees, paperback novels clutched like passports. I recognized some of them vaguely from around the neighborhood. Dahlia with the gray pixie cut and always perfect lipstick. Mina who walked a three-legged dog. Harriet, who wore scarves even in August. They smiled when I introduced myself, but I still felt like a substitute called in at the last minute. Useful, but temporary. The first few meetings, I barely spoke. I let the tide of their words carry me. Discussions about grief in a novel, about complicated mothers in memoirs. I didn't have to explain myself, just nod, sip my tea, and laugh in the right places. Then one night, the book was about estrangement. A daughter who stopped speaking to her mother after a betrayal. The room went still after a particularly raw passage. Dahlia spoke first. My son stopped calling 5 years ago. No argument. Just vanished. Her voice was calm, but her hands tightened around her mug. Another woman, Jude maybe, said her daughter only visited for Thanksgiving and Easter. She brings the kids, but not her heart. It's like talking through glass. And I realized then, I wasn't alone. These weren't women broken by life. They were just bruised in places they'd learned to cover with routine and recipes. So I spoke. Not all of it, just a corner. I said, my daughter doesn't call often. We lost something years ago, and I think we're both afraid to look for it. They didn't ask for more. They just nodded. Like I'd said something they'd already heard in their own hearts. After that, Eva began sitting beside me. Dahlia passed me her biscotti tin without asking. Harriet offered me a ride once when it rained. One afternoon, I was rearranging books at home, trying to make room for the new ones from the club, when I found the photograph again. The original. Frayed corners, the ink slightly faded. I placed it between pages of an old journal, and something in me stirred. That night I wrote about it. Not for Rachel. Not for Charles. For me. I described the moment the photo was taken. How Rachel's hair was windblown, how Charles had squinted in the sun, how I'd thought, this is our real life. I wrote about the silence that came later, about the weight of words never said. The next meeting, Eva mentioned an idea. Let's each bring a short piece next week. Something personal. Something borrowed from life. I nearly said no. But I didn't. When I told them I'd written something, they looked surprised, then pleased. Will you read it aloud? Eva asked. My throat tightened. I'll try. That evening, I sat on my porch again. The same porch where I'd watched letters wait, where I'd listened to my phone ring without hope. But tonight the dusk felt different. Softer somehow. The folded paper sat in my lap. Just a few paragraphs. But mine. For the first time in a long time, I felt like a woman with a story worth telling. Not the whole book, but a new page, layered on top of old chapters. And I was ready to turn it. The living room hummed with the quiet rustle of paperback pages and the clink of mugs against saucers. Eva had lit a candle this time, lavender and something herbal, and the soft scent threaded the air. The chairs were arranged in a loose circle, some with cushions, some without. Margaret sat with her folded paper trembling slightly in her hands. Whenever you're ready, Eva said with a kind smile. Margaret took a slow breath. Her throat felt dry. She glanced once around the room. Dahlia sat beside her, knitting in her lap but untouched tonight. Grace and Anya leaned forward in their seats. No one spoke. Then Margaret began. Her voice was soft at first, uneven on the edges. There's a photograph in a frame that used to sit on the mantel. She read the story she had written. The one about the photograph, the one with young Rachel and Charles caught in a moment she was never part of. She wrote about standing outside the frame, always outside, wondering if she'd ever been enough inside anyone's picture. She didn't name names. She didn't need to. She talked about the ache of being remembered not for her laughter, or her hands always full, or her quiet strength, but for her worry, her reminders, her refusals to let go. The weight of being the one who stayed. The burden of being the one who held things together just long enough for them to break anyway. She finished with a line she hadn't written until this morning. Sometimes, I wonder if silence is the only language grief speaks fluently. When she looked up, the room was still. Dahlia's eyes were wet. She dabbed them with the corner of her sleeve. Grace was staring at her lap, unmoving. Eva leaned forward and whispered, "That was brave." Margaret didn't know what to say. Her hands still trembled. Then Anya, the quietest in the group, spoke. Can I read it again? Can you send me a copy? I'd like to share it with my daughter." Margaret blinked. "You want to share it?" Anya nodded. "She thinks I never hurt. That I was just controlling. Maybe if she read this, she'd see something else." Another voice, Dahlia. "It felt like you wrote my life," she said, choking a little. "I don't even have the photograph anymore. But I remember it. Just like that." Margaret looked around at them, not just at the faces, but the shoulders hunched slightly forward, the hands clenched and unclenched on knees, the breath held too long in someone's chest. And in that fragile stillness, something softened. She was no longer trying to fix her story. She was just telling it. Eva handed her a cup of tea and touched her arm gently. "You brought something important tonight." Margaret smiled faintly. "It was just a memory." Eva shook her head. "It was more than that. It was a truth." As the evening wound down, the women stayed a little longer than usual. They helped gather teacups and fold up blankets, their conversation quieter, slower, as though walking through the residue of something sacred. Margaret left last. Outside, the streetlights painted the sidewalk in gold and shadow. Her hands were cold, but her chest felt light. Not healed, but aired out. When she got home, the house was still. She placed the folded story on her kitchen table and stared at it for a moment. Her phone buzzed on the counter. She picked it up. A message from Rachel. Just 3 words. I read it. That was all. No punctuation. No explanation. But Margaret stared at the screen for a long time. And in the stillness her breath caught, not in sorrow, but in a beginning. It was the first time Rachel had stepped through the front door in over 2 years. She knocked, though she never used to. Margaret opened the door and tried to smile, the kind you offer at funerals, kind, small, unsure. Rachel held nothing in her hands. No bag, no gift, not even her usual guarded stance. Just herself, and something else Margaret couldn't quite read. Hi, Rachel said. Hi, Margaret replied. They stood in the threshold for a beat too long, until Margaret stepped back. Come in. Rachel did. They sat in the kitchen, where the linoleum still peeled at the edges and the kettle still whined just before it boiled. The light from the window framed Rachel's face in soft shadow. Margaret poured tea. Green for herself, chamomile for Rachel, just as she used to. They spoke in soft, steady nothings. How's work? Busy. Conference season. The neighbors planted new roses. Bright yellow this year. Nice. The pauses were long, but not heavy, like 2 musicians waiting for the other to begin the real melody. After 20 minutes, the conversation ran out of places to hide. Rachel's hand trembled slightly as she touched her cup, then let it go. Her eyes stayed fixed on the steam. I was angry at you, she said, without looking up. Margaret didn't flinch. I know. No, I mean, angry at you for staying. A small, sharp breath escaped Margaret, but she said nothing. Rachel pressed on. I saw them. Dad and that woman. I was 15. I was supposed to be at swim practice, but I came home early. You didn't know. Margaret's stomach knotted. She folded her hands in her lap. I thought, Rachel continued, that you didn't know. That you were too proud or too proper, or maybe too afraid. I thought you let him walk all over you. Margaret's voice was barely above a whisper. I did know. Rachel looked up. Her eyes flashed with confusion, then pain. You knew. I did. I found the hotel receipt in his coat pocket. Confronted him the next day. Margaret paused, her fingers tightening slightly. We fought. He cried. I didn't. Not then. Rachel shook her head. Then why? Why didn't you leave? Margaret looked out the window. The roses did look bright this year. Loud even. Because we had a mortgage, she said softly. Because your brother was still having night terrors. Because you were rehearsing for your solo in choir. Because I couldn't bear the thought of pulling everything apart just to be right. Rachel blinked. Margaret could see her face calculating, testing each word like a fragile stare. I wasn't weak, Margaret added. I was surviving. Sometimes survival looks like staying. Sometimes it means choosing quiet strength over loud exits. Rachel's lips pressed together. She looked away. Her face was no longer hard, just raw. I thought you chose him over yourself. I didn't, Margaret said. Il chose us. All of us. Silence pressed between them again. But this time, it pulsed with something alive. Rachel reached out, slowly, unsurely, and laid her hand over Margaret's. It was not a dramatic gesture. No tears. No apology. Just skin touching skin after years of guarded distance. Margaret felt warmth travel up her arm. Not from the contact itself, but from the gesture it represented. Something unspoken had shifted. Like a window cracked just enough to let fresh air in. Neither of them said the word forgiveness. Neither of them needed to. Rachel's voice was soft again. Your story, the one in the letter. I didn't think you had that kind of voice. I didn't either, Margaret said, smiling gently. Until I wrote it. Rachel nodded. I'm glad you did. Margaret could feel something knitting slowly between them. Not mending, not yet, but beginning. A seam tentative and new. I'm sorry I never asked, Rachel said. About what it was like for you. Margaret shook her head. You weren't supposed to. You were the child. I was the one meant to carry the weight. Rachel's eyes brimmed. Maybe we carried different kinds. A long, quiet moment passed. Then Margaret stood. I made shortbread earlier, she said. Still warm, if you want some. Rachel laughed, the sound breaking the tension like glass cracking in sunlight. You always bake when you're nervous. Margaret smiled as she pulled the tin from the counter. Then you'll be eating a lot today. They sat at the kitchen table, two women bound by history, bruised by silence, and tethered by something more enduring than either had words for. They ate in silence, crumbs dotting the napkins like the past, scattered but no longer threatening. Outside, the roses swayed. Inside, the door to something new creaked open. Not wide, but enough. Rachel called the next morning. Her voice was quiet, but not cold. I was thinking, she said, about your birthday. We should redo it. Just us. Nothing big. Just something. Margaret hesitated. The memory of that dinner, the empty chairs, the overcooked chicken, the silence, still sat raw in her mind. But she also remembered Rachel's hand over hers in the kitchen, the fragile piece that had started to form. All right, she said. Just us. They met on Sunday. Late morning. Margaret opened the door to see Rachel holding a brown paper bag and a flat white box tied with twine. She wore no makeup, no guarded expression, just a soft, uncertain smile. Margaret gestured her in. You hungry? Starving, Rachel said, setting the bag down on the kitchen counter. I brought pancake mix. The good kind. Margaret raised an eyebrow. You know how to cook pancakes? I read the instructions, Rachel replied with mock pride. That counts. They cooked together like strangers learning a dance. Margaret handed her the whisk. Rachel nearly dropped the milk. They laughed, a little awkward, a little genuine. The scent of vanilla and batter filled the kitchen, settling over them like a warm quilt. They sat at the table with their plates, steam rising between them. No balloons, Margaret said, looking around. No expectations, Rachel replied. They ate slowly, letting the quiet exist without drowning in it. Margaret noticed the way Rachel studied her plate, how she moved her fork in slow circles even after she'd finished. He texted. Rachel finally said, not looking up. Mark. I didn't ask him to, but he saw the photo. Said he was sorry. Margaret blinked. Oh, he said. I didn't know. Rachel glanced at her. I think none of us did. Margaret sipped her tea. It's all right. It's not, though, Rachel said softly. But maybe it will be. When they finished eating, Rachel stood and picked up the white box. This is for you, she said, placing it in front of Margaret. A real gift this time. No flowers from the gas station. Margaret smiled and untied the string. Inside, nestled in soft tissue paper, was the photograph. The photograph, now carefully framed in simple, pale wood. On the back, a small note was taped. Margaret turned it over and read. To Mom, my safest place. Still. Rachel. Her throat tightened. She didn't cry. Not quite. But when she looked up at her daughter, her voice caught. Thank you, she said. This means more than you probably know. Rachel just nodded, her own eyes a little glassy. I think I'm starting to. They washed dishes side by side. Margaret scrubbed, Rachel dried. The clink of porcelain, the soft hum of the faucet, it all felt oddly sacred. There was no grand conversation, no healing crescendo. But the air had changed. Lighter now. Less fragile. Like they were no longer standing on opposite sides of a closed door. As Rachel gathered her coat and keys, she paused at the threshold. I'll come by again, she said. If that's okay. Margaret reached out and straightened the collar of Rachel's coat, like she used to when she was little. It's more than okay. When the door closed behind her daughter, Margaret stood still for a moment, holding the framed photo in her hands. She traced the edges with her thumb, then placed it on the shelf by the window, right where the light could find it. It hadn't been a birthday, not the way people meant it. No candles, no cake, no loud declarations. But it was something else entirely. A beginning. And that, Margaret thought, was worth more than any wish. The hallway was narrow, the paint a soft eggshell white that had dulled over time. A small nail protruded from the wall, just above eye level, where the school portraits used to hang. Every September, Charles had hammered a new one in, right alongside the last. A crooked timeline of growing faces and missing teeth. Rachel in pigtails. Mark with a gap-toothed grin. Charles always said, "A wall that tells a story is better than one that tries to forget." Now the wall had only one photograph. Margaret stood before it, the frame balanced in her hands. The photo was the same one from that drawer, now cleaned and softly reframed. Rachel's handwriting in gentle script on the back. "To Mom, my safest place." Still, she exhaled. Not a sob. Not joy. Something steadier. The nail held easily. The frame clicked into place with a quiet certainty, like it had always belonged there. Margaret took a step back. The hallway felt fuller, not because of the image, but because of what it carried. Not a frozen memory. A mark of motion. A scar that had become skin. She didn't look away for a long time. That evening, she made tea the old way, with the kettle, not the microwave. She sliced lemon and watched the steam rise. She had never loved silence, but now it felt earned, as though she'd dug her way to a quiet that didn't echo. The letters still sat in the basket by her recliner. Some to Rachel, some to Charles, some to herself. She didn't need to send them anymore. She just needed to write them. At book club that week, she read aloud a new piece, short about lilacs in April. Dahlia smiled the entire time. Eva brought brownies and a poem she wrote on napkins. The group had grown by 2 members. There was chatter now before and after the readings. Laughter that Margaret joined in on, not just politely, but genuinely. When someone asked her if she was a writer, she shrugged then nodded. "I suppose I am." Some evenings Rachel called. Sometimes to talk, sometimes just to check in. Once, just to ask what kind of tea Margaret liked again. The calls weren't long, but they were real. Mark hadn't visited, but he'd sent a photo of her grandkids drawing with chalk in the driveway. He'd typed, "They asked about you today." Margaret printed it out and stuck it on the fridge with a magnet shaped like a tomato. The house still creaked in the same spots. The clock in the kitchen still ticked too loud. The old mailbox still leaned slightly right. But everything felt less hollow. Margaret still walked alone each morning, rain or sun. She still stopped at the corner where the street dipped into shadow and morning birds gathered. She'd close her eyes and listen, her palms open at her sides. Not in prayer exactly, just in pause. She'd thought grief was a hole, a deep, collapsing pit. But it was more like a shifting ground beneath you, steady some days, slippery others. And healing wasn't a clean line upward. It was a slow circle, a return to self with new folds. Hanging the photograph didn't fix what was lost. It didn't rewrite birthdays or soften old silences. But it planted something, a seed of witness. One afternoon, Margaret stood in front of the photo again. The hallway light was dim, dust catching in the beam. She traced the edge of the frame with one finger. "I'm still here," she whispered. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't even a statement to anyone else. Just a truth she needed to hear in her own voice. And then she turned, walked back down the hallway, and left the light on.